Hello, friends. You might have seen last night there was yet another meltdown over a Trump remark having to do with Russia and foreign interference and that sort of thing. And I think it's actually worth dispassionately going through and demonstrating why this is yet another example of an unhinged hysteria being fomented over something that is, at essence, really trivial and innocuous. I mean, if you've been following even fleetingly the entire Trump presidency, you'll know that every so often, not quite as often now as it happened in, say, 2017 or 2018, there was some Trump comment or some supposed bombshell that broke that was supposed to change everything and was supposed to, lead to Trump's immediate ouster. And we had another example of that yesterday where Trump was in the White House and he was being interviewed by George Stephanopoulos. By the way, I was a little surprised that Trump even bothered to agree to an interview with George Stephanopoulos. But apparently he did. And Trump was asked whether he would go to the FBI if some foreign person, not even necessarily a representative of a foreign government, if a foreign person approached him and offered information that was damaging on an opponent. And Trump said he disagreed with Christopher Wray, the FBI director, that one should immediately go to the FBI if they were to receive information of that sort. But what really caused a major meltdown was when Trump said, quote, "I think you might want to listen. There isn't anything wrong with listening. If somebody called from a country, Norway, and said, 'We have information on your opponent,' oh, I think I want to hear it." Now, I know people are so primed to interpret anything Trump says in the most inflammatory possible manner, but just think about what he actually said there. Somebody from Norway, so a random Norwegian, calls Trump, right? And says, "Hey, here's some damaging information on your opponent, or here's some just general information that isn't even necessarily damaging on your opponent." Trump said he would merely listen to that information. It is not a crime to listen to information simply by virtue of the person conveying that information being a foreigner. I'm sorry, it's just not. Are we now to believe, really, that if, say, a Kamala Harris staffer received an email or a phone call or a text message from a Canadian or a Norwegian or a Frenchman, and the person that they're communicating with states information that is regarded as disadvantageous to a political opponent, that Kamala Harris staffer is then going to run to the FBI and report it as an instance of interference, foreign interference? I highly, highly doubt that. And if they actually did do that, it would be the height of hysteria, because that's not interference. The term interference has been so diluted and so expanded beyond any recognizable definition that it really has come to mean whatever you want it to mean that has to do with some foreign entity. It's not interference to speak to a foreign person and for that person to tell you something that is negative about a political opponent. Robert Mueller actually seems more cognizant of the free speech implications of this drive to criminalize the receipt of foreign information than many Democrats or many people in the media, including journalists. So Mueller did exhaustively go through the circumstances of the 2016 Trump Tower meeting that was infamously organized by Rob Goldstone, who I've had on my podcast and is on the channel if you want to listen to it. And Mueller concluded that nothing happened there rose to the level of prosecutability. And in fact, he cited explicitly that the First Amendment could, quote, pose constraints on any prosecution of Don Jr. or Kushner or anybody else who attended that infamous meeting, because all they really did was receive information or be on the listening end of somebody who was a foreigner telling them information. Now, if you criminalize that, it runs the risk of criminalizing political speech for no other reason than the fact that the person that you're engaging with happens to be from a foreign country. If somebody from, I don't know, Israel, right, comes to the United States and tells you something negative about your political opponent, you are not thereby committing a crime by listening to that information simply because the person is Israeli. In other words, the act of listening to that information does not become criminal simply because the person is from Israel or any foreign country. And I think if that standard were more universally applied to Israel in particular, or even the UK or Canada or wherever, you'd find that a lot of people are engaging in potentially criminal conduct. But these people have no long-term awareness of what it is that they're advocating. If they want this to be criminalized, then they're subjecting all number of unsuspecting people to potential prosecution, and they are running into some serious First Amendment issues. Actually, Hakeem Jeffries of New York explicitly called for criminalization on this score. He said yesterday after Trump's comments that Trump had, quote, embraced treasonous behavior. So that's the chairman of the House Democratic Caucus accusing Trump of embracing treason. And I know people are supposedly offended by that when Trump does it, but when Democrats do it, it's no big deal. I don't think either should do it because treason is actually an offense that is articulated in the Constitution, and nothing Trump has done or said, or nothing the Democrats Trump has accused of treason actually amount to treason in any technical sense. So just don't use the word, even if you're doing it in a colloquial sense, because it just poisons the well of American political discourse. Anyway, Hakeem Jeffries went on to say that anyone who's on a campaign who accepts information from a foreigner, essentially, quote, should be locked up. So Hakeem Jeffries, speaking presumably on behalf of the Democratic caucus in the House, wants legislation to amend the criminal code to make it illegal to do what Trump said that he would do, meaning Trump would take a phone call from a Norwegian who isn't necessarily even affiliated with the Norwegian government, even as if that would be necessarily terrible, and receive information that is potentially damning of a political opponent. Hakeem Jeffries says that should be illegal. Now, when you impose blunt instrument criminal law in result to political events, inevitably it's going to end up harming people who get swept into the ensuing, state power grab, and it always has unintended consequences or even intended consequences depending on what you think motivates Jeffries. So it's really incredible because what are people saying should be done here exactly? So if you're a low-level campaign staffer and you meet somebody in Washington, D.C., and the person tells you something negative about your opponent, are you therefore obliged to determine whether that person is a foreigner? How would you go about making that determination? Do you assess their potential accent? Do you assess their racial characteristics? What is the criteria here that we're working with? Because it's a major slippery slope here to say that engaging with a foreigner in a certain way is automatically tantamount to a criminal act. Even Mueller, who was hell-bent on bringing charges against people in the Trump orbit if he could in any way have done so, declined to bring charges on this score because he felt that the campaign finance violation that supposedly occurred as a result of the Trump Tower meeting didn't pass scrutiny and wouldn't have been permissible, potentially, in light of First Amendment constraints. And then there's also the issue that people just gloss over or ignore, right? That the Hillary Clinton campaign retained a law firm in 2016 that then contracted with Fusion GPS, this intelligence firm, and contracted Christopher Steele, a foreign intelligence operative, to gather, quote, dirt on Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton's political opponent. And according to Steele, the sources from which he gathered this information were people affiliated with the Russian government. And that information was then passed along back into the American political arena. So how in the world would that not qualify as interference under the criteria now being hysterically set forth by people who say that Trump must be impeached as a result of his comment last night to George Stephanopoulos. The Hillary Clinton campaign didn't just receive information from a foreigner, they paid for it. By an intermediary, yeah, but it later came out that they were the ones paying for it. It doesn't make any sense. There's no coherent standard here. Anyway, people are now screaming, and the Democratic presidential candidates are reiterating that impeachment now is even more imperative than ever. There's going to be a impeach Trump rally at Foley Square in New York City, Manhattan, this coming Saturday. I'm going to be there and observing, so that should be fun. If you are perversely interested in that sort of thing, maybe you'll find me and say hello. But yeah, I mean, there's a theory that Trump wants to be impeached and therefore is goading Democrats to initiate impeachment proceedings by making statements like these. Potentially that's a factor, but I don't know. I think it's just Trump spitballing, and he doesn't even really care, ultimately. It's kind of a more banal and less salacious explanation, because nothing he said was that crazy. I mean, again, I know this sounds like a right-wing talking point, but it's just incontrovertibly true. The Hillary Clinton campaign engaged more explicitly in interference with foreigners, and more provably and tangibly with interference with foreigners, including foreigners dealing with Russia, than the Trump campaign did. That's just true. And you can not like it, but it seems like that's a reality, and it just gets completely ignored when people launch themselves into a frenzy when Trump makes a relatively innocuous and unremarkable statement like this. I mean, Twitter was having like a nuclear, a 5-alarm fire, emergency last night, and it's carried through to today in reaction to this Trump comment. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say for now, and I will talk to you later.